upset my friends back east. That's my current temperature.
Yeah, Bob, we had 6 inches of snow.
Half the audience just logged off. Poll question number 1, anonymous. We want to know how often are you having to complete SBA Form 912 on your obligors after the change in the requirement of the form? When was that instituted, Lance? That change?
It was instituted middle part of last year when the 1919 when the 1920 became the main SBA application form. And of course, previously, and Bob, I started working on SBA loans in 1983. From 1983 through 2014, you had to get a 912 on everybody. There was
you were in that high school SBA high school employment program, right, where they hired you during your high school years?
I guess that tells my age, Bob. I was working on SBA direct loans, for those of you who may have been around long enough to remember those, but the 912 was a requirement. Now, if the obligor responds appropriately, you don't have to get a 912. So I was just curious, how often are you having to get 912?
70% say 25% of the time, 30% say never. So
yeah, that doesn't surprise me, Bob. I expected those numbers. I was just curious.
Great. Question number 2. How often do you have to submit a loan authorization change to SBA for approval for a change in the use of proceeds? Same percentages. Thank you very much for participating in this. It helps give Lance a little bit more background in terms of tailoring his comments. And this one's all over the board. We have, I'll let a couple more people vote. All right. 50% say less than 25% of the time. 17% between 25 and 50% of the time. 22% more than 50% of the time. And 11%, call it 10%, never.
Well, Bob, I was just curious about this. When I was deputy director at SBA, and prior to one of the changes in servicing procedure, all the loan authorization change requests came back to Little Rock or Fresno at that time. And the most common servicing action that we dealt with were those loan authorization change requests. And now it's changed. You submit your loan authorization change request up to the point of final disbursement to the processing center. And after the final disbursement, you would change those or send those to either Fresno or Little Rock. So I was just curious. One of the things that the Closer series should help do or help you with is hopefully lessening the number of loan authorization change requests that you'll have. What's really important on underwriting and closing an SBA loan is getting accurate information in there. And if you have good, accurate information, you're going to have fewer change requests.
Lance, you said the takeaway for this week was definition of prudent lending. And let's go ahead. We got a couple questions. By the way, if you want to ask a question, you can do it now. Just shoot it over to josephcomereport.com or put the question in the go-to webinar interface. Email question number 1. This is about an express line of credit. Does SBA require that a plan to pay off a line of credit by the end of the guaranteed period be contained in the loan file? I wasn't sure if proof that the loan would pay out by the end of the guarantee period was just for non-revolving loans or if that included revolving loans as well.
I'll just respond to that one, then we can go to the use of proceeds question. The answer is no. SBA does not require that you have a plan for payoff of the express revolving line of credit. In fact, probably one of the more common things that happen, Bob, to an express revolving line of credit is they end up getting termed out at some point in the life of the line of credit. So the answer is no, you don't have to have something in file. Now, would a prudent lender have something like that in file? Yes. But it's not a requirement.
And that's always a theme that I appreciate you doing. Just because SBA lowers the standard of what you can do doesn't mean you have to manage or perform at that lower level. You can always demand more. Number 2 question. It seems that working capital can be used as a catch-all for anything that isn't detailed in the authorization in the use of proceeds section. Are there any details about this that you have to be careful or to make sure you document?
Well, when you have a change in the use of proceeds, as long as it doesn't exceed 10%, you can move it into working capital. There's really nothing special that you have to do in documenting that. It's an accepted practice to move changes in authorization less than 10% into working capital. Even the SOP 5010 addresses working capital and its disbursements. You have to document your disbursements. It's critically important for an SBA loan lender in the closing process to document those disbursements well. Get the 1050 executed at the beginning, but each disbursement needs to be documented well, and we cover that in this training. But the 5010 also talks about working capital disbursements, and it says if working capital disbursements are going to be for normal operating expenses, that doesn't require any special documentation. So the answer to the question is yes, working capital is kind of a catch-all for those differences in the use of proceeds, but also always make sure the SOP reads 10% or $10,000, whichever number is less. If it's more than that, then you're going to need to send a loan authorization change request to the processing center to get that approved by SBA. And it's critically important, Bob, because when you look at early default loans, proper use of proceeds and documentation of the disbursements is one of those critical items that they look at on an early default loan.
Question number 2. We have requested a transcript from the IRS for the 2011 tax return, but the results came back as no filing. We had a copy of the customer's return and requested the officer clarify. The borrower went to one of the IRS offices and got a stamped copy of the return, and the officer wanted to use this one as the transcript copy. He stated that this is the way they would handle the situation at his previous bank if there was no information from the 4506T request. I did not see any information in the SOP that stated that we could substitute a stamped copy for a transcript. Legit.
Let me just, in fact, Bob, I've dealt with this in a real SBA loan circumstance. We had a 4506T submitted. 2 of the years came back and 1 came back with no return. IRS indicated that it was a glitch in their system, that they actually had a copy of the filed tax return. So they sent a stamped copy. The SOP is not real clear, and one of the things that I would share with all of our participants, there are a lot of gray areas in the SOP. But it's not real clear. My recommendation, especially in this circumstance, because it appears if you requested 11, my question would be, did you get the years surrounding it? In most circumstances, let's say if you requested 10, 11, and 12, and you got 10 and 12, but you didn't get 11, and you have a stamped copy, my recommendation would be to send that in to the processing center and just make them aware of it and get them to concur with it. I think it's critically important to make sure that SBA is okay with it. And the SOP, and you're right, the SOP really doesn't state whether a stamped copy of the tax return will fulfill that transcript obligation. Now, I will tell you that I've seen it approved time and time again by the processing center when there is a situation where you don't get one of the 3 years and you've got a stamped copy of the tax return. They typically will approve that. But my recommendation is send it in and get SBA's concurrence.
How long will that process take? Because you're going to hold up the loan closing, correct?
It could in fact hold up the loan closing, but my recommendation would be don't close the loan until you get them to say it's okay, because the 4506T issue results in a number of repairs, and I've also seen it result in some denials. Again, we talked about on use of proceeds. It's an important item on the early default loan. The 4506T is probably the most important item.
You know, I think what you're saying is prudent. In the heat of the battle, you're trying to close these loans. You're going, oh, you know, we got to get this done. But you're right. A lot of the repairs come from 4506 issues, and if you notify, as you said, if you notify SBA, they're going to go along with it. You're in the file. You can sleep well at night. I know.
Well, and I think, Bob, you bring up a great point. The borrowers are always in a hurry to get their money, and I understand that. I owned a small business, Bob. I don't know if you know that, but I had couple of Radio Shack franchises. Now, for those of you who Radio Shacks filed bankruptcy now, I owned them many years ago, Bob, back when Radio Shack was doing well. But when I borrowed money, I wanted it yesterday. But as an SBA lender, you want to make sure, in particular, areas like the correct use of proceeds being provided to SBA, and if there's changes, you get them approved. In areas like the 4506T and the tax transcripts, and making sure if there's a missing year that you get SBA to give you their concurrence on that stamp return. Those are critically important, and it especially becomes important. Well, it's important on all SBA guarantee purchases, but if you have an early default loan and you sent in a 4506T and you didn't get one of the years and you had that stamp return and you didn't get SBA's blessing on it, you could face certainly a repair in that circumstance and possibly a denial.
This is now Stump the Professor round. We have a couple questions that have come in.
Oh, no.
Here we go. When verifying tax returns to transcripts, are we required to verify the borrower, or do we have to do all of the principals and guarantors?
You want the borrower and the obligors. You know, let's just say, Bob, you and I are starting a restaurant, and the restaurant's Bob's Chop House. Of course, there is a Bob's Chop House in Dallas, excellent place to get a good piece of red meat, but you would want to get the 4506T on the business, and Bob and I as well as obligors.
Nonprofits can apply for an SBA 7A loan as long as they can support the debt, correct?
Incorrect.
By the way, just as trigger, you can't do it.
Yeah, USDA, I was going to say, one of the basic parameters of eligibility is that it's a for-profit small business.
By the way, just completely off topic, USDA B&I loan program can be to nonprofits. When verifying tax returns to transcripts, I apologize, we already got that one. We use a reconciled stamp after review of transcripts in lieu of a memo. This stamp has been dated and signed by the reviewer. Is that acceptable?
Yeah, we used a reconciled stamp after review in lieu of the memo and dated and signed by the reviewer. That's going to be okay. The key thing that SBA is looking for, so many lenders will have the 4506T, Bobs, and they'll have the transcripts, but they don't show any evidence as a prudent lender that somebody took a look at the two and compared them. And the banks that I work with, it doesn't have to be a multi-page memo, but I'll ask them to write a 3 or 4 sentence memo that says, I've reviewed the tax returns and the transcripts and find no material differences with whoever reviewed its signature and date. The important thing is to show that somebody's taken a look, and you indicated that it was dated and signed by the reviewer, and I believe that that will pass with SBA.
Lance, please clarify that the debt to service coverage ratio of 1-to-1. I thought this requirement was removed for loans of less than $350,000 as the new credit score model fulfills that requirement.
And you are correct. That information, the credit score overrides the 1-to-1 requirement. But Bob, I'm gonna back up to the prudent lender concept. I mean, I wouldn't make a loan to somebody who couldn't show me at least. I mean, I'm a 1.2-to-1 guy. But SBA has these requirements in the SOP. Again, on the loans of less than 350, the credit score now kind of supplants that 1-to-1 requirement. But you're going to calculate the debt service coverage anyway, and you want somebody at least at one to one, I would think. So,
as an aside, we just released a video about 18 minutes ago that said a banker out of Rhode Island was being criticized by the OCC for underwriting loans simply based on the SBA credit score and not calculating debt service coverage ratio, and the regulators required them to immediately, bam, classify those as substandard. So again,
well, I think the SBA requirements, the most important SBA requirement in the entire SOP, Bob, and we talked about this at the opening. We had a session on this week, is being a prudent lender. And a prudent lender is underwriting, closing, servicing, and liquidating your SBA loans the same way you would a similar size non-SBA guaranteed loan. So if you're doing a loan of less than $350,000 and your internal policy requires a debt service coverage ratio of 1.2 to 1, then my recommendation is to do your SBA loans that way, even though the SBA doesn't require it. Because, Bob, I worked for the FDIC at one point in my career, and I probably would look at your commercial lending policy, and I would probably criticize you on that as well. So
yeah. And again,
the answer to the question is you are correct, but as a prudent lender, you're going to require that, or even a better debt
last
service
question
coverage.
is number 4 on the list there, Lance, for an SBA Express loan. For an SBA Express loan, the slide states the maximum loan amount is $350,000, but the maximum guarantee is $3.7 million. Please explain.
Okay, the maximum, and that's a good point.
I think we got you on that.
But Bob, it's not an incorrect slide. It just needs clarification. The maximum SBA Express loan size is $350,000.
Right.
The maximum guarantee amount is $3,750,000. Now, what that is looking at, let's say you have a 7A loan sitting out there for $4 million, or let's just say $5 million, and you've already used up your $3,750,000 guarantee. You can't do an SBA Express loan on top of that for $350,000 because it's a different type of 7A loan. So again, $350,000 is the maximum Express loan. The maximum guarantee amount, irregardless of the program you use combined, is $3,750,000. But thank you for bringing that up because it is a little confusing the way it was presented.
We appreciate the questions. One more, Lance. You mentioned in your training that an SBA loan can be used as a line of credit. Can you please elaborate?
Well, I mean, SBA Express program has a revolving line of credit. We use SBA 7A loans. Bob, in fact, one of my participant banks that I work with as a lender service provider, I brought them a client, and the client needed a term working capital loan. It wasn't really a line of credit, but we did a term working capital loan. There's also a working capital SBA loan that you can do under the 7A program. It's a little difficult to administer and manage from a bank's perspective, but there are revolving line of credit programs both in the Express, which Express is a 7A loan, by the way, in the Express program and the regular SBA 7A loan program.
I apologize for running on. We got a bunch of questions. I normally like to keep these for 15 minutes. Indulge us for a couple more minutes as Lance tells us about week 2.
Is Joseph? Yeah, week 2 is a very important week for us because we're going to talk about the loan authorization, the credit memo. The loan authorization is such an incredibly important document because it dictates how you close the loan, it dictates how you service the loan, and if the loan ever goes into liquidation, it's going to certainly dictate what information you need to gather in order to get paid on the SBA guarantee. I've said this, and I probably said this in the training, Bob. I look at the SBA loan authorization as the Bible of SBA lending, and it is a very important guide. We're also going to talk about the credit memo. We're going to talk about how to do changes to the SBA loan authorization. We'll touch base with use of proceeds and how to properly document use of proceeds. So week 2 is a very important week.
Well, very good, Lance. Thank you all for joining us for office hours. I hope you're enjoying the class. We love the questions. Please keep them coming, and we will reconvene a week from today for week 2's office hours at 2 o'clock Eastern. Thank you all very much.
Friday.
Have a nice weekend.